There is a shot near the very end of regular show where two brothers who have been trying to kill each other for the entire length of the universe finally stop fighting, and instead of a punch, one of them offers an embrace, and the two of them drift together into the light of a dying sun. It lasts only a few seconds. It is scored so gently that you almost miss how enormous it is. And if you go back through the 8 seasons that came before it, quietly, patiently, without ever announcing what it was doing, you will find that the show had been telling you this was coming the entire time. Not in the way a mystery tells you things, with clues you're meant to catch. More like the way a dream tells you things, where you don't understand the shape of it until you're already standing inside the ending. Tonight is about those shapes, the dreams inside the show that turned out to be real, the old drawings on an alien wall that showed a fight that hadn't happened yet, the dozens of small, strange, easy to miss moments scattered across 240 some episodes that were quietly pointing at a hug inside a sun long before anyone watching knew there would be a hug or a sun or a reason to cry about either one. I'm Velvo, and this video exists to help you sleep. So get low, get warm, and let's start walking backward into the parts of regular show that were prophecy long before they were payoff. The place to begin, oddly enough, is the ending itself, because you cannot see a prophecy fulfilled until you know what it was pointing toward. So let's sit with it plainly, the way the wiki sits with it, the way the show itself finally let its cast sit with it after 8 years of never quite naming what Pops actually was. In the show's final stretch, it's revealed that the sweet, doddering, lollipop-headed man who has spent the entire series being gently confused by vending machines and roller coasters is not human at all. He is one half of a cosmic duality born on a planet called Lollyland, the good half, the half built by that planet to embody kindness and order, and his existence required, by the same cosmic accounting, the creation of an opposite. That opposite is his brother, and the show's own characters end up giving him the nickname that stuck. They call him Anti-Pops. His real name, the one the natives of Lollyland use, is Malum Cranus, and Pops's true name in that same accounting is Megacranus. The two of them are fated, every 14 billion years, to fight for the fate of the universe, and every single time, across billions and billions of cycles, the fight ends the same way. It ends in a draw. Neither one is strong enough to beat the other outright, so the universe resets, and the cycle begins again, with neither brother remembering what came before. This time, though, something is different, and the difference is Mordecai and Rigby, whose small, scrappy interference tips a fight that had been perfectly balanced for the entire history of everything. And when the moment finally arrives, when Pops realizes that fighting anti-Pops, the way the universe has always expected them to fight, will only produce the same stalemate it has produced every single time, he does something else. He grabs his brother mid-battle, and instead of throwing a final blow, he holds on. He tells him, in whatever way beings like that can tell each other things, that he loves him. And the two of them, Pops and Anti-Pops, weakened and reconciled, and finally at peace with each other after an eternity of enmity, drift together into their home star and are gone. Pops sacrifices himself. The cycle breaks. The universe, for the first time in 14 billion years, does not have to start over from nothing. And the show, having spent 200 and something episodes being a workplace comedy about two idiots who barely do their jobs, ends on the quiet, devastating suggestion that the actual solution to an eternal cosmic war was never going to be victory. It was always going to be forgiveness. That is the shape of the ending. Now we go looking for its shadow, cast backward across everything that came before it. Before we go there, though, I want to ask you something, because I always like knowing who's actually here with me at this hour. Tell me in the comments where you're watching this from and what time it is where you are right now. I like picturing all of you scattered across time zones, half awake, half in the park with me. Okay, let's keep going. The very first place the show hides a piece of its own future is so early and so unassuming that most people watching it for the first time have no reason to flag it as anything but a fun premise engine. In the first season, Mordecai and Rigby discover an old, oddly powerful electric keyboard sitting in the attic of the house they live in, an instrument the show calls, simply, the power. The first time they play it, they find out it can bend reality around them, undo mistakes, rewind bad decisions, warp the actual physical rules of a Tuesday afternoon. For a good stretch of the show's early run, it functions as exactly what it looks like: a convenient gag machine, a reset button the writers could reach for whenever a plot needed an escape hatch. And then, gradually, without much comment, the show stops treating it that way. It gets folded into the background. It becomes a fact of the house rather than a focus of the episode. Nobody explains where it came from. Nobody explains why two groundskeepers happened to have, sitting unguarded in their attic, an object capable of altering the fabric of causality. And here's where the shape of it becomes visible only in hindsight. That keyboard, that same one, the power, is the exact object Mordecai and Rigby use in the finale to travel backward through a reset timeline, to recover Mordecai's stolen memories, and to physically return to the moment of the final battle so that Pops can be given the chance to choose differently. An object introduced in the show's very first stretch of episodes, treated for years like a background prop, turns out to be the literal mechanism by which the ending gets rewritten into something survivable. I want to be careful here about what's verified and what's interpretation. It is verified, plainly, factually, that the power appears early and that the power is what gets used at the climax of the finale to break the loop. What is interpretation? What belongs to the corner of the fandom that reads the whole show as more deliberately architected than a comedy about slackers usually gets credit for, is the idea that the writers knew from the beginning exactly what that keyboard would eventually be needed for. I don't think anyone can prove that. But I also don't think it matters whether they knew, because a story doesn't have to be planned in order to become true. Sometimes a show plants something because it's funny, and years later, the story needs exactly that thing to be there, and it still counts. It still lands the way it lands. The son doesn't ask when the tool in the shed turns out to be exactly the right tool, whether his father put it there on purpose all those years ago. He just uses it, grateful it exists. The second piece of the show's future that was sitting in plain sight for years involves an episode most casual viewers remember, if they remember it at all, as one of the stranger, spookier half hours in the show's back half. It's called the Dream Warrior, and on its surface, it's a fairly simple horror pastiche. Pops keeps having his sleep invaded, night after night, by something crawling around inside his dreams, trying to find out where he lives. His friends notice because his nightmares are physically dangerous, an unexplained power occasionally causing things around him to levitate in his sleep, something the show had actually shown once before, an episode earlier in its run, without much follow up at the time. Eventually, the gang manages to get inside the dream with him, using tea, and a strange ritual Skips walks them through, and they discover the intruder is a genuinely unsettling nightmare, alien, purple skinned, hammerhead shaped, working for someone unnamed. Pops beats him. The episode seems to resolve, and then, in its final seconds, the show cuts away to reveal who that alien was actually reporting to, a shadowy figure at a computer, watching, laughing to himself, and for one half second, as he turns toward a window that looks out onto open space, you catch a piece of his face. It looks almost exactly like Pop's. It is worth sitting with how quietly that landed the first time it aired. There was no dramatic sting, no cliffhanger card, just a single, near subliminal glimpse of a face that shouldn't exist, tucked into the last shot of what otherwise plays as a fairly self contained, spooky episode. That was the actual first appearance of Antipops, months before he showed up properly and got named by Mordecai and Rigby in a later episode. The show had already put him on screen. It had already shown you his face. It just trusted you not to notice, or trusted that noticing wouldn't matter until much later, when the show finally needed you to remember that you'd seen him before the story ever told you who he was. There's a detail worth flagging here, too, one that's simply true rather than speculative. The character was voiced by Robert Englund, the actor best known for playing Freddy Krueger, and the entire structure of the episode, an evil presence stalking someone through their dreams, invading sleep itself as a form of attack, is a direct, deliberate echo of the nightmare on Elm Street films. The show wasn't being subtle about that reference. It wanted you to clock the actor's history even if you didn't clock the plot's future, and that's part of what makes this specific piece of foreshadowing so unusual compared to most television prophecy tricks. Most shows that want to plant a future villain do it through dialogue, through a name dropped in passing, through a portrait glimpsed on a wall. This show planted its final antagonist through casting itself, through the simple, almost prankish decision to hire a man famous for playing a dream stalker to voice a dream stalker, and to let the joke of that casting choice function, completely unannounced, as the earliest possible clue toward where the whole story was actually headed. The third layer down goes even further back than that, back to a character whose backstory the show didn't reveal until deep into its run, but whose thematic shape had been sitting in the show's bones since nearly the beginning, quietly rehearsing the emotional argument the finale would eventually make out loud. Skips, the Yeti groundskeeper, who fixes everything, who never seemed surprised by anything, who moves through the park by skipping instead of walking, gets a full origin episode that recontextualizes almost everything about him. His real name isn't Skips, it's Walks. In 1814, as a mortal teenager attending a strange school populated by an order of ancient, babyish immortals called the Guardians of Eternal Youth, he falls in with a girl named Desdemona, Mona for short, and the two of them fall for each other the way teenagers do, over dances and shared errands and a school prom they help decorate together. There's a bully at that school, a monstrous figure named Clorgbane, who Mona specifically doesn't want Walks to fight because she doesn't like violent men, and Walks, wanting to be worthy of her, promises he won't. But the conflict finds them anyway, at the prom itself, the one occasion Clorgbane will apparently accept a confrontation on, and in the resulting fight, using a weapon called the Fists of Justice that the Guardians had been steering him toward the entire episode, Walks wins. He defeats Clorgbane, and Mona, in the middle of that same fight, is killed. It's a genuinely brutal gut punch of an episode for a comedy that otherwise plays as broad and silly, and the show doesn't soften it. Walks, devastated, agrees to accept immortality from the Guardians, a deal that requires him to keep defending the world against Clorgbane's return every 157 years, and he changes his name, taking on a habit Mona had teased him with, skipping instead of walking, because walking, apparently, was what he'd been doing on the day he lost her, and he never wanted to do that again. That's the verified backstory. Here's where the prophecy hides inside it. Skip's entire life, as the show eventually reveals it, is the story of someone who becomes immortal specifically because of an eternal, cyclical fight against a returning evil, a fight he has to keep having over and over across centuries, a fight that costs him someone he loved. And years later, Pops turns out to be living almost exactly that same story at a scale so much larger it's hard to hold in your head all at once. An eternal, cyclical fight against a returning evil, one that has been happening every 14 billion years since the beginning of time, a fight that will eventually cost him his life, the same way Clorgbane's fight cost Skips the person he loved. The show built its slowest, quietest, most centuries-old character around the exact emotional architecture it would later reveal was the entire cosmic architecture of its own finale, and it did that years before anyone watching had any reason to connect the two. I want to be honest about where fact ends and reading begins here. It's fact that Skip's origin story and Pops's cosmic backstory share this structure, immortality granted through loss, a recurring battle tied to keeping the world safe, a personal cost buried underneath a duty nobody else on the staff fully understands. Whether the writers consciously built Skips as a smaller rehearsal for what Pops would become is not something I can verify, and I want to say plainly that I haven't found an interview where anyone on the creative team confirms that intention directly. But the pattern itself is verifiable and sits right there on the surface once you know to look for it. And it's the kind of thing that makes you wonder whether some stories get written twice inside the same show before the writers even realize they're telling the same story at two different sizes. Let's go somewhere quieter for a moment. into an episode that has nothing to do with cosmic war on its surface and everything to do with it underneath, because the show's habit of hiding its ending inside its smallest, least flashy corners doesn't stop with wizards and yetis. It happens with prom dates too. It happens with fights between best friends over nothing. There's a stretch of the show's middle seasons where Mordecai's entire emotional arc gets tangled between two women: Margaret, the steady, grounded coffee shop worker he's been quietly pining after since the pilot, and CJ, a literal cloud being, volatile, gorgeous, capable of summoning actual weather when she's upset. Fans have spent years arguing over which one he should have ended up with, and the show, when it finally resolves that arc, refuses to give him either of them. Margaret goes off to build her own life, her own career, and the show treats her departure with a level of respect that a lot of workplace comedies wouldn't have bothered with, letting her simply be a person with her own future rather than a prize waiting to be claimed. CJ, after seasons of stormy intensity, quietly fades from Mordecai's life, the way a lot of intense 20s relationships fade, not with a villain reveal, not with a betrayal, just with two people slowly realizing they need different things. And then, in the finale's closing montage, Mordecai is shown, years later, having become a working artist, meeting someone entirely new at a gallery opening, a Batwoman he falls for and eventually marries, someone the show never gives a name to on screen at all. It's worth being precise about that last detail because there's some genuine confusion about it online. The character has no name in the actual aired episodes. A writer named her informally years afterward in a fan conversation, explaining that the name had never actually been settled on during production. That's a small, almost funny piece of trivia on its own, but it's also, in its own way, a kind of prophecy fulfilled about the whole shape of Mordecai's arc. For years, the show made you obsess over exactly which named, established, richly developed woman he was going to end up with. And the actual answer, when it finally arrived, was someone entirely unplanned, entirely outside the frame the audience had been staring at, someone the show cared about so little as a plot mechanism that it genuinely never got around to giving her a name. That isn't a flaw in the writing. Read one way, it's the writing's whole argument. The show had been quietly telling you, across dozens of episodes, about indecision and second guessing and the agony of choosing between two people who each represent a different kind of life. That the actual answer to growing up isn't picking correctly between the options you've been given. It's becoming the kind of person capable of recognizing something good when it shows up somewhere you weren't looking. Mordecai's whole romantic arc was a slow, unannounced rehearsal for that exact lesson, staged over and over in smaller relationships until the finale delivered it at full size. There's a companion piece to that arc sitting inside Rigby's story, and it's worth walking through slowly because it might be the single clearest example in the entire show of an early joke turning, years later, into an actual thesis statement. For most of the series, Rigby is written as a kind of comic engine of arrested development. He's lazy. He avoids responsibility instinctively, almost athletically. He never finished high school, a fact the show treats for years as a running gag rather than a wound, tossed off in passing the way sitcoms toss off backstory they don't plan to use. And then, deep into the back half of the run, the show decides to actually use it. Rigby, pushed by Eileen's quiet honesty about the kind of partner she wants, goes back to finish his diploma in his late 20s alongside teenagers a decade younger than him, and the show stages his slow, humiliating, genuinely difficult effort to pass classes. He should have passed years earlier with a seriousness it rarely affords anything else. He fails. He gets frustrated. He almost quits more than once. And when he finally does it, when he walks across that stage and gets his diploma, the show doesn't play it as a punchline. It plays it as one of the biggest triumphs in the entire series. Here's the layer underneath that. The show's actual final season is fundamentally about a species of unfinished business come due after billions of years of being deferred, a fight between brothers that has never been properly resolved, only endlessly postponed and reset. Rigby's arc, small and human, and scaled to a single classroom instead of an entire universe, is the same shape in miniature, an old, embarrassing, unfinished thing, avoided for years, finally faced instead of pushed off one more time. The show spent its whole run rehearsing, in the register of a 20-something sitcom, exactly the emotional move its cosmic finale would eventually require its most powerful character to make. Face the thing you've been avoiding. Stop resetting. Finish it properly, even if finishing it costs you something. Rigby's graduation isn't proof that the writers were plotting the finale seasons in advance. It's proof that the show had one real story to tell about growing up, and it kept finding new sized rooms to tell it in until the story got big enough to require a universe. Now to something a little stranger, something that sits right at the edge of verified fact and interpretation, and I want to walk it carefully because it involves the show's one theatrical release, a movie a lot of casual fans never got around to seeing. Regular Show, the movie, released in 2015 while the series was still airing, follows Mordecai and Rigby into a future where an army led by a vengeful former teacher, Mr. Ross, is trying to unravel time itself using a weaponized rift. The show calls the Timonado, created accidentally by a science class prank gone wrong back in the boys' high school days. The plot twists through the kind of causality loops these stories usually twist through, and at its emotional center is something much simpler than time travel, a lie Rigby told years earlier to protect his friendship with Mordecai, a lie about a rejection letter, finally coming due, finally threatening to break the two of them apart at the exact moment they need each other most to fix the timeline. They repair the friendship, they fix the damage. The universe survives because two friends manage to tell each other the truth instead of letting resentment calcify into something permanent. I want to flag, honestly, that some corners of fan discussion connect this movie more directly to the finale's cosmology than the credited material fully supports, occasionally suggesting the film's events are explicitly foreshadowed inside the series finale itself. What is solidly documented is simpler, and I think more interesting anyway. The movie is a story about the danger of letting an old wound between friends go unaddressed until it nearly destroys everything, resolved only through honesty and forgiveness rather than through winning a fight. That is structurally, beat for beat, the same solution the finale reaches for on a cosmic scale 2 years later when Pops solves an eternal, unwinnable war, not by finally landing the punch. Neither brother has ever been able to land, but by choosing honesty and love instead of the fight everyone, including the brothers themselves, assumed was the only available option. The movie rehearsed the emotional physics of the ending in a smaller, funnier, lower stakes arena, using two idiot groundskeepers and a time Nado instead of two cosmic beings and the literal fate of existence. Whether that was deliberate long range planning by the writers or simply the fact that a show only really has one true thing to say and keeps finding fresh disguises to say it in, I can't verify. But the pattern holds up under scrutiny, and once you notice it, you start to feel the whole show quietly rhyming with itself. There's an image inside the finale itself that almost nobody talks about when they talk about the ending, and it deserves more attention than it gets because it's the single, clearest, least deniable piece of literal, textual, in universe prophecy the show ever put on screen. When the park crew finally arrives on Lollyland, Pops' home planet, in the last handful of episodes, the natives there, beings called Frivola Cranus and Quadravi Cranus, among others, walk them through the history of the endless war between Pops and anti-Pops, using old painted wall panels, ancient murals depicting the two brothers locked in combat across cycle after cycle after cycle, each version of the fight ending the same defeated, stalemated way, and, remarkably, each mural also depicting versions of Mordecai and Rigby's own crew fighting alongside Pops, over and over, across incarnations that stretch back farther than recorded history. Let that sit for a second. The show gave its characters and its audience a literal, physical, ancient depiction of the ending before the ending happened, an actual prophecy object built into the show's own mythology, showing that this exact configuration, this exact fight, has occurred before, will occur again, has always ended the same way. It is, structurally, the most on the nose piece of foreshadowing the show ever produced, and it hides in plain sight specifically because it arrives so late, deployed almost as exposition rather than mystery, explained to the characters directly instead of left for the audience to decode. But it retroactively reframes every quieter, earlier piece of foreshadowing we've already walked through tonight. The keyboard in the attic, the face in the window during a nightmare episode, skips a centuries old cycle of loss and duty, Rigby's unfinished diploma, Mordecai's unnamed future wife. None of those were random accidents of good writing. They were, the show now tells us directly and without an ambiguity, small local instances of a pattern that has apparently been repeating since the birth of the universe. The show wasn't just quietly hinting at its own ending for 8 years. According to its own mythology, the ending had already happened an uncountable number of times before the story we watched even started, and every version of Mordecai and Rigby in every one of those cycles had, in some fashion, lived through some version of exactly what we watched. Let's step back out of Lollyland and into something much closer to Earth, into a piece of trivia about how the show was actually cast. Because even the mechanics of who voices whom turn out to carry a strange, quiet echo of the show's deepest theme. It's fully documented, easy to verify, and something the show's own trivia pages note plainly. Sam Marin, one of the principal voice actors, plays three of the show's most emotionally important characters. He is Benson, the perpetually furious middle manager. He is Muscle Man, the performative, insecure tough guy, grieving a father he can't stop mythologizing. And he is Pops, the gentle cosmic being hiding an entire universe's worth of grief and destiny behind a lollipop shaped smile. J.G. Quintel, the show's creator, voices both Mordecai and High Five Ghost. That's a fact, not a theory, confirmed across cast listings and the show's own credits. What belongs to the realm of interpretation, the part I want to flag honestly as a reading rather than a confirmed intention, is what fans have done with that fact emotionally. The argument goes that having a single human voice inhabit the show's angriest character, its most insecure and performative character, and its gentlest, most cosmically burdened character isn't just a budget driven casting choice, even if that's exactly what it practically was. It's also, whether anyone planned it this way or not, a strange kind of accidental unity, three very different emotional registers: fury, performance, and tenderness, being carried by the exact same set of vocal cords, episode after episode, as if the show had been quietly suggesting, underneath its own casting logistics, that these are not really three separate emotional postures at all. They're three different ways one person, or one universe, learns to survive the same underlying pressure. I don't think the show meant for that reading to exist. I think it's something the audience built, generously, out of an accident of scheduling and budget. But once you've heard it, you can't quite unhear it whenever Pops speaks in that same warm register Benson uses to yell and Muscle Man uses to boast. And you start to wonder whether some kinds of meaning get built by an audience's love just as thoroughly as they get built by a writer's intention. I want to spend a little time now on the show's holiday specials because they carry one of the more understated pieces of its long range foreshadowing, hidden inside episodes that most people remember, if they remember them at all, as pleasant seasonal filler rather than mythology. The Halloween specials treat the membrane between the ordinary and the supernatural as something unusually thin. Characters dying and coming back, real monsters showing up without much comment, the show's own sense of humor sharpening into something a little more genuinely unsettling than its usual register. The Christmas specials go even further, treating Santa Claus as a real, cosmically significant being with real power, someone who exists inside the same fabric of the impossible that everything else in the show quietly runs on. None of this, on its own, points at any specific plot point in the finale. But taken together, stacked up across 8 seasons of specials that keep casually reaffirming that the supernatural in this universe is not an exception, it's a baseline. They function as a kind of slow drip preparation, training the audience, episode after episode, to accept that anything, Genuinely anything could turn out to be real and cosmically significant in this world. By the time the show finally reveals that its sweetest, silliest character is secretly a god locked in an eternal battle for the fate of existence, the audience has already been quietly rehearsed for years in accepting exactly that kind of scale shift without blinking. That's not a specific prophecy about pops. It's something more like weather conditioning, the show slowly turning up the humidity of its own impossibility until the day it finally rains cosmic war, and nobody in the audience is surprised that it can rain that hard. Death himself deserves a mention here too, because his presence across the show quietly rehearses something the finale needed the audience to accept without argument: that dying in this particular universe doesn't always mean staying dead. He shows up as a recurring character, a leather jacketed motorcycle riding figure with a wife and a son, someone the show treats with a strange mixture of genuine dread and warm, familiar humor, someone who can, under the right circumstances, be talked into letting a soul return through some game or wager or trick. Across dozens of episodes, long before the finale, the show trains its audience to understand that mortality here is negotiable, that the rules can bend, that loss doesn't have to be the end of the story. When Pops dies at the climax of the finale, and the show frames that death with real weight, real grief, a memorial statue, actual mourning from characters who rarely show that kind of emotion, it lands as devastating specifically because the show has spent years teaching you that death in this world sometimes gets undone, and then it doesn't get undone here. Pops stays gone. The show, having spent its whole run softening the rules of mortality as a comfort, chooses its most emotionally important death and refuses to soften it at all. And that refusal only hits as hard as it does because of everything that came before it, quietly telling you the opposite was possible. There's a piece of real world, behind the scenes history that functions almost like its own kind of prophecy, and it's worth including here because it's fully documented and because it changes how you might think about everything we've walked through tonight. J.G. Quintel has spoken publicly in interviews given around the time of the finale about the fact that he'd told Cartoon Network from early on to simply let him know whenever they were ready to end the show, because he wanted the chance to close it out properly rather than have it canceled out from under him. By his own account, the reality set in sometime around the middle of the seventh season, when the network's renewal came through smaller than previous ones, a signal that the show's time was running down. Quintel has also described separately being told by the network at points earlier in the run to tone down some of the show's more adult-leaning content, a real tension between what the writers wanted to make and what a network aimed at younger viewers was comfortable airing. None of that is speculation. It's the show's own creator on the record, describing a production reality where an ending was being negotiated, planned for, prepared, well before most viewers had any reason to suspect the show's back half would swerve as hard into cosmic stakes as it did. That context reframes the entire back half of the series. The space arc, the sudden tonal shift into long-form, high-stakes storytelling, wasn't simply a creative impulse arriving out of nowhere. It was, At least in part, a team of writers who knew the clock was running, using that knowledge to escalate everything that had quietly mattered the whole time, spending their remaining episodes finally paying off years of undernoticed setup. Whether every individual piece of foreshadowing we've discussed tonight was placed with the ending already in mind is something I genuinely can't verify, and I want to be honest about that limit. But the broader claim that the writers knew an ending was coming and used that knowledge deliberately is not speculation. It's the show's own creator telling you so in his own words after the fact. Let's talk about pairs for a while, because once you start counting them in this show, you cannot stop, and the count itself starts to feel like an argument the show was quietly building toward its final image. Mordecai and Rigby, obviously, inseparable since the pilot, defined almost entirely by their friendship rather than by anything either of them accomplishes on his own. Pops and anti-pops, two halves of the same cosmic origin, destined to face each other. Skips and walks, the same person separated only by time and grief, one name worn over the other like a scar healing wrong. Margaret and CJ, two versions of a life. Mordecai spends years failing to choose between. Muscle Man and High Five Ghost, an odd, tender friendship that crosses what should be an uncrossable line between the living and the dead, treated by the show as simply normal. Even death has a family, a wife, a son, a life outside the job, paired off the same way everyone else in this world eventually gets paired off. None of this is secret or hidden. It's right there on the surface of 200 and some episodes, easy to notice once somebody points it out. What's worth sitting with is what the show finally does with all of that accumulated pairing when it reaches its actual ending. The climactic scene is not a victory. It's not one brother beating the other. It is, specifically and deliberately, two halves of a single cosmic pair finally facing each other honestly after billions of years of facing each other as enemies instead, and choosing at the very last possible moment to be at peace instead of at war. Every pairing the show spent 8 years quietly cataloging across its supporting cast turns out to have been circling the same underlying question the finale finally asks at full volume. Can two halves of something learn to stop treating each other as opposition and start treating each other as family? The show never says this out loud as a thesis. It just keeps building duo after duo after duo, the way a composer keeps returning to the same four notes in different keys, until the day arrives when those four notes turn out to have been building toward one final, enormous chord. There's a smaller, stranger thread running underneath all of this, involving the show's small cluster of magical objects. And while I want to be careful not to overstate what's actually confirmed here, the pattern itself is documented plainly enough to walk through. Beyond the power, the reality bending keyboard from season 1, the show quietly introduces other objects over the years that carry similarly outsized, barely explained cosmic weight. A giant mallet. Skips produces from seemingly nowhere whenever ordinary problem solving has failed, treated as a last resort, an object whose origin is never fully accounted for. Occasional artifacts tied to the guardians of eternal youth and their long history with skips. Assorted relics that show up once, solve a crisis, and then vanish back into the show's background without further comment. None of these get formally tied together inside the aired series into a single explained system. But the accumulation itself is the point. By the time the final season sends the crew hunting across space for cosmic relics needed to resolve the war between pops and anti pops, the show has already spent years training its audience to accept that this universe is quietly, casually full of objects like that. Tools older than the people using them, tools whose full history nobody bothers explaining because the show trusts you to simply accept that some things in this world have always been more powerful than they look. That's not proof. The writers had a master document mapping out a complete artifact mythology from day one, though some fans like to believe exactly that. And I want to be clear that particular claim sits firmly in the territory of speculation rather than verified fact. What is verifiable is the pattern of behavior, object after object, treated with unexplained reverence, folded into the background rather than fully resolved until the finale needed exactly that kind of casual, cosmic abundance to make its own relic hunt feel earned rather than sudden. I want to bring in one more piece of documented history before we start moving toward the close of tonight's walk, because it complicates and deepens everything we've talked about so far in a way I think is worth sitting with, honestly. This video was written with the assumption, like most retrospectives of this show, that regular show ended fully and finally back in 2017, its last frame a quiet, bittersweet image of an old man reading in a mansion window while his friends live out ordinary lives below him. That was true for a long time. It is worth knowing and being upfront about that more recently, Cartoon Network confirmed a new regular show project moving forward, with Quintel returning as showrunner, and a revival, released under the title Regular Show, The Lost Tapes, actually arrived in the middle of last year. I haven't watched it, and I want to be honest that anything I'd say about its content would be speculation dressed up as knowledge, so I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I find something quietly moving, almost accidentally poetic, in the mere fact of its existence, sitting on top of everything we've spent tonight discussing. A show that ended by breaking an eternal cycle, whose entire finale was built around the idea that some loops need to finally stop resetting so the people inside them can move forward into real, unrepeating lives, has itself, in the real world outside the fiction, been pulled back for another turn. I don't know what to do with that except notice it, gently, the way you'd notice a familiar song playing faintly from another room. Maybe it means nothing beyond ordinary television economics, a beloved property getting revived the way beloved properties tend to get revived. Once enough time has passed and enough nostalgia has accumulated around them. Or maybe there's something a little bit fitting about a show whose deepest theme was the difficulty of actually letting a cycle end, getting pulled gently back into one more cycle of its own. Before we come all the way back down, I want to walk through the specific, plainly documented shape of how the show actually chose to end things for each of its characters, because the fate it hands out to each one carries its own small, quiet echo of everything we've discussed tonight. Mordecai leaves the park behind after roughly 6 years working there, moves away, becomes a working artist, and eventually falls for a woman he meets at his own gallery opening, someone the show never bothers naming on screen, a detail some fans find disappointing, and I find, honestly, kind of moving, because it means the show cared more about what that relationship represented, a life built after letting go of the versions he'd been chasing for years, than it cared about giving audiences one more named character to catalog. Rigby and Eileen get married and build a family together, the culmination of an arc that spent years training him, slowly and awkwardly, to become someone capable of the kind of honesty Eileen had offered him from the very beginning. Muscle Man and Starla raise a family of their own. High Five Ghost, still and always a ghost, still and always treated by the show as simply one more person, deserving of an ordinary, loving life, ends up happily settled with someone of his own. Benson, whose entire run had been defined by barely contained fury, is shown finding some late, hard won contentment. And Skips, immortal, unaging, endlessly patient, is the only one still working at the park by the time decades have passed, still there, still the one holding the door open for whatever comes next. None of this is speculation. It's documented plainly in the finale's own closing montage. But taken together, it forms one more layer of the same argument the whole night has been circling. This was never really a show about cosmic war, even though it ended with one. It was a show about what it costs and what it eventually gives back to actually finish growing up. Every character's ending fate reads less like a plot resolution and more like a report card on how honestly they'd faced the thing they'd spent years avoiding. The ones who finally told the truth got families. The one who could never stop being kind, even when kindness cost him everything, got to be the one who saved the universe by refusing, all the way to the very end, to stop being exactly what he'd always been. I want to go back to something we touched on briefly: the show's strange, persistent habit of resolving conflict through games rather than through violence or negotiation, because once you start looking at it as its own quiet mythology, it starts to feel like a rehearsal for exactly how the finale gets solved. Across the run, an enormous number of the show's biggest crises get settled not through a fight in the conventional sense, but through a contest, a board game, a video game tournament, an eating challenge, a bet, a wager against some cosmic figure who has shown up to claim something. The famous Emmy winning episode, built around finishing an enormous plate of eggs for a trucker hat treats, that challenge with the same operatic seriousness the show usually reserves for its actual apocalyptic stakes, complete with a fever dream vision quest and a genuine sense that something important is on the line, even though the literal prize is a hat with the word excellent stitched onto it. That's not an isolated joke. It's a pattern the show returns to constantly. The idea that the actual rules of this universe are less about brute force and more about contest, wager, cleverness, the right kind of commitment to a dumb, sincere thing. And here's where it quietly folds back into the ending. When the final battle between Pops and Anti-Pops actually gets fought, it isn't won through raw strength, even though both brothers are, by the show's own accounting, close to equally matched in power. It gets tipped by Mordecai's idea to set traps, to give Pops a strategic advantage he's never had in any of the billions of previous cycles, a piece of clever, structural cheating rather than a straightforward show of force. And then even that doesn't ultimately decide things. What decides things is Pops refusing to fight the fight at all, choosing an embrace over a final blow, which is, if you squint at it, its own kind of game theory move, a refusal to play by the rules the universe has always assumed were the only rules available. The show spent years teaching its audience, through eggs and trucker hats and rigged board games, that the actual way you win in this universe is by finding the angle nobody else thought to take, the clever move sideways instead of the obvious move forward. Pops's hug is the biggest version of that lesson the show ever delivered, dressed up as cosmic tragedy instead of a Tuesday afternoon prank war, but built from exactly the same underlying logic. Muscle Man deserves his own turn here too, because his arc carries one of the more understated pieces of thematic foreshadowing in the entire show, hidden inside a character most casual viewers remember mainly for a single, deliberately repetitive joke about his mother. Underneath that joke, though, is a genuinely careful character study about the gap between the self a person performs and the self they actually are. Muscle Man calls himself a tough guy, despite having no particular physical toughness to speak of. He frames his entire identity around his late father, a beloved, larger than life strongman figure the show eventually reveals, in one of its most quietly devastating episodes, to have actually been a much gentler and more thoughtful man than the legend Muscle Man built up around him. The show spends years letting Muscle Man perform a version of himself shaped by grief and inherited myth rather than by anything he's actually observed to be true. And it treats the eventual softening of that performance, the moments where he lets himself cry, lets himself grieve his father honestly, instead of mythologizing him, lets himself be tender with the people he loves, instead of constantly posturing as some of its most important character growth. Here's the quiet echo. Anti-Pops, when we finally understand who he actually is, turns out to be something very close to the same structural problem at cosmic scale, a being defined entirely by a role he was born into, an inherited mythology of pure evil he never chose and can't seem to escape, performing destruction because destruction is what he was told he was for, right up until the very end, when Pops's embrace finally lets him drop the performance and show something closer to remorse, something closer to an actual self underneath the myth. Muscle Man's small, human scaled arc about outgrowing a father's legend, and Anti Pop's cosmic scaled arc about outgrowing an entire universe's expectation of him, rhyme with each other in a way the show never comments on directly, but which becomes hard to unhear once you've noticed it. The show, again and again, at every possible scale, kept telling the same story about performed identity finally cracking open into something more honest underneath. It told that story about a small green man's dead father years before. It told it about the fate of all existence. There's a recurring anxiety the show returns to constantly that's worth pulling into the light here, because it functions almost like a drumbeat underneath everything else, the threat of losing the park itself. Across the run, the park faces closure, sale, demolition, repurposing, again and again, in episode after episode, always resolved by the staff's willingness to fight, embarrass themselves, or otherwise commit to keeping the place alive. It's a pattern that repeats often enough to feel less like coincidence and more like the show quietly testing, over and over, exactly how attached its characters actually are to a life they spend most of their time complaining about. And then, in the actual final season, that anxiety stops being a recurring bit and becomes literal, physical, undeniable fact. The park is ripped bodily off the surface of the earth and turned into a fugitive spacecraft, fleeing across the galaxy for years while its staff fight to survive far from home. Every earlier threat of losing the park, all the near misses and close calls the show played for comedy across its middle seasons, turns out to have been a smaller scale rehearsal for the one loss the show finally lets actually happen. And the emotional beats the show reaches for once that happens: homesickness, grief for a place rather than just a job, the slow, hard won relief of eventually getting to go back, land as powerfully as they do specifically because the show spent years quietly training its audience to feel the weight of almost losing this exact place over and over, long before it finally let the loss become real. I want to spend a moment on how the show actually looks, because even its visual language turns out to carry a strange, retrospective kind of prophecy inside it, one that's harder to point at directly, but worth sitting with anyway. The animation style throughout the run is deliberately understated, simple, geometric character designs set against softly painted, hand textured backgrounds, a combination that gives the whole show a quality some viewers have described as looking a little like a memory, rather than a place being witnessed directly, as if you're watching something being recalled rather than something happening in real time. That's a reading, an interpretation rather than a piece of confirmed authorial intent, and I want to flag it honestly as such. But it's a reading that gains a strange new weight once you know how the show actually ends, with an old man remembering his friends from a window somewhere far away, with a group of adults returning, changed, to a place that looks the same but isn't quite the same anymore, with an entire cast eventually shown, decades later, gathering for a reunion that plays like a photograph of something that's already gently, irreversibly become the past. A show that always looked a little like it was being remembered rather than witnessed turns out, by its very last frames, to actually be a show about the process of things becoming memories, friendships turning into the kind of thing you look back on instead of the kind of thing you're still living inside. I don't think the animators, sketching out backgrounds for a silly episode about a hot dog eating contest in season 2, were consciously building toward that final emotional register. But the visual grammar they settled on early, for whatever practical or aesthetic reason actually drove it, turned out to be exactly the right grammar for the story the show eventually decided to tell about itself. And that kind of accidental rightness is its own quiet, unplanned form of prophecy. The way a house built for one purpose sometimes turns out to be perfectly shaped for a completely different life lived inside it later. There's one more visual thread worth pulling on here, smaller and more speculative than most of what we've walked through tonight, but worth including because it's the kind of pattern that becomes hard to unsee once someone points it out. Margaret, across the show's run, is consistently rendered with a strong red coloring in her design. Anti-Pops, when he finally appears, is given a similarly strong red palette, contrasted directly against Pop's much softer pastel tones in a way that codes their conflict visually before either character says a word about it. It's a reading, not a confirmed statement of intent, but the pattern is consistent enough across the show's design choices that it feels worth naming. Red recurring as a kind of visual signal for stakes that run deeper than they first appear, whether those stakes are romantic or cosmic. If that pattern is deliberate, and I want to be clear, I can't confirm that it is, it would mean the show was quietly telling its audience, through color alone, long before anyone understood what Pops actually was, that the feelings Mordecai carried for Margaret and the war Pops would eventually have to face were operating on some shared emotional frequency, both of them confrontations with something the character in question didn't fully understand about themselves, both of them coded, visually, the same exact shade. Let's take one more pass through the show's relationship with cycles themselves, because once you've seen the finale, you start noticing how often the show, in its smaller episodes, was quietly rehearsing the idea of a day, or a job, or a mistake, resetting and starting over. Time travel shows up across the run more than most casual viewers probably remember. Characters glimpsing futures, encountering past versions of themselves, undoing mistakes through whatever mechanism the plot needs that week. None of that, taken individually, points at anything specific, but taken as an accumulated habit, stacked across years of episodes that keep returning to the idea that time in this universe is soft, revisable, capable of looping back on itself. It starts to feel like the show was slowly acclimating its audience to the deepest structural fact of its own finale, that Pops and Anti-Pops' war has already happened in some form an uncountable number of times before, that the universe itself has been quietly looping, resetting, trying again for 14 billion years, without anyone inside any given loop remembering the loops that came before. A show that kept letting its two idiot groundskeepers bend and rewind small, personal timelines for years was, whether anyone involved intended it this way or not, training its audience in exactly the kind of thinking required to accept, without much resistance, that the entire universe they'd been watching had been doing the same thing at a scale too large for anyone inside it to notice. Mr. Maillard is one of the show's quietest characters, and also, I'd argue, one of its most carefully hidden pieces of long-range foreshadowing, precisely because the show uses him so sparingly. He's the wealthy, severe owner of the park, harsh with nearly everyone, especially Benson, dismissive of cosmic disasters as long as the business side of things stays intact. And then Pops enters a scene, and something in Millard's entire register shifts, a tenderness the show never explains and never extends to anyone else. For years, that's simply a character quirk, an odd, mostly comedic soft spot in an otherwise gruff businessman. It only becomes legible as something else entirely once the finale reveals what Pops actually is, and what Mylord all along must have known or at least suspected. Once you understand that Pops is a cosmic being placed on Earth, raised in a mansion nobody else seems to own, treated as a beloved son by a man who otherwise shows almost no softness to anyone, Maillard's every earlier scene recontextualizes itself. Every gentle look, every uncharacteristic patience, every strange moment where his gruffness cracks for just a second in Pops's presence reads differently in hindsight. I want to be careful here because the show never confirms directly, in dialogue or in any documented interview I could find, that Mylord knew from the start exactly what Pops was, or that he'd spent decades deliberately building an elaborate cover, a park, a staff, an entire operation, purely to keep his son hidden and safe. That reading is squarely in the territory of fan interpretation, generous, moving, and completely unconfirmed. What is verifiable is simpler and honestly still quite affecting on its own. The show gave Mylord a consistent, unexplained softness around Pops for years before it ever explained why that softness might exist. And when the explanation finally arrived, it fit that old softness so precisely that it hardly needed restating. Sometimes a character detail doesn't need to be a deliberately planted clue to function like one. It just needs enough consistency, held long enough that when the truth finally shows up, it slides into a groove that's already been quietly worn into the shape of the story. There's a subtler thread running through the show's monster of the week structure that's worth naming here, too, one that ties more directly into the space arc than most of the show's other quiet foreshadowing. Across its middle seasons, the show returns again and again to stories involving possession, things from outside ordinary reality forcing their way in, uninvited, through people, through objects, through the house itself. None of these episodes get treated as connected mythology on the surface. They read, individually, as standalone horror comedy bits, a keyboard shaped demon here, a haunted go kart there. But stacked up across years, they build a quiet, cumulative sense that the boundary between this world and whatever lies just outside it is thinner than the show's daytime comedy tone usually lets on, that things keep finding their way through, that the staff keep having to push them back without much fanfare, treating the genuinely uncanny as an ordinary occupational hazard. By the time the space arc finally arrives and the show reveals that the park's entire reality has been under sustained pressure from a cosmic war bleeding in around its edges for the whole series, that idea doesn't land as a sudden left turn so much as a slow reveal of something the show had been quietly gesturing at for years, one small possession of the week's story at a time. It's a reading rather than a confirmed authorial plan, and I want to be upfront that no interview I found ties the show's horror comedy episodes explicitly to the cosmology of the finale in a deliberate, planned way. But the cumulative pattern is there to notice, regardless of whether it was designed on purpose, and noticing it changes how those older, smaller episodes feel once you go back and rewatch them. Eileen is worth returning to here because her arc carries maybe the gentlest, least dramatic piece of the show's long foreshadowing, and it's easy to miss precisely because nothing about her story is loud. She begins as a small supporting character, a quiet, bespectacled mole nursing a crush on Rigby that the show plays for laughs in its early seasons. Over time, without much fanfare, she becomes one of the most emotionally honest characters in the entire cast. Someone who consistently tells the people around her exactly how she feels when she's hurt, when she's happy, when she wants something, without the avoidance and second guessing that defines nearly everyone else on the show. It's a quality the show never makes a big production out of. It simply lets her keep being that way, episode after episode, patient and plain spoken, while everyone around her tangles themselves up in things they're too afraid to say directly. And when the finale finally needs its cast to face an unfaceable, eternal problem, honestly, instead of running from it one more time, that's precisely the quality the story turns out to require. Pops solves the unsolvable war not through strength, but through simply, finally, being honest with his brother about how he feels. Rigby solves his own smaller, human scaled crisis of arrested development, largely because Eileen's plain spoken honesty finally gives him something worth becoming honest in return for. The show spent years quietly modeling, through its least flashy character, the exact emotional skill its cosmic ending would eventually require from its most powerful one. Nobody frames Eileen as a prophet. She never delivers a speech about the nature of truth. She just keeps being the one character who says what she means for years until the show finally needed that specific skill to save the universe, and it turned out she'd been rehearsing everyone in it the whole time, one quiet conversation at a time. I want to bring in the show's long fascination with the 1980s here too, because it holds one more small, tucked away piece of foreshadowing about the show's actual relationship to endings. Regular Show is steeped in that decade's pop culture throughout its run, its music, its arcade cabinets, its synth driven soundtracks, its action movie sensibilities, treated with an affection that borders on reverence. One of its recurring antagonists, a giant floating disembodied head named Garrett Bobby Ferguson, is built entirely around this obsession. A former video game champion so unable to let go of a high score set decades earlier that his identity and, eventually, his continued existence as a vengeful ghost become entirely organized around reclaiming it. The show frames his defeat, again and again, across multiple appearances, as something both funny and quietly tragic, a warning dressed up as a boss fight. Read generously, and I want to flag this reading as interpretation rather than confirmed intent. Garrett Bobby Ferguson functions as the show's clearest embodiment of what happens when you refuse to let a cycle end, when you let an old glory calcify into the entire shape of who you are instead of growing past it. That's not a coincidental theme for a show whose actual finale is built around Pop's finally breaking a 14 billion year cycle that had, until that exact moment, always simply repeated. The show spent years using a giant nostalgic video game ghost as a comic runner about the cost of refusing to move past your own best day, and then it built its entire final season around a character finally choosing to move past the only pattern he'd ever known instead of letting it repeat one more time. Whether the writers consciously connected those two ideas is something I can't confirm. But it's hard, once you've seen both, not to feel them rhyming with each other from opposite ends of the show's run. Here's one that I think is the single most literal piece of foreshadowing in the entire back half of the show, and it hides in plain sight in the most mundane possible place, an episode title. In the run up to the final battle, one of the last handful of episodes before the finale itself is called Kill 'Em with Kindness. Sit with that for a second, because it is not a vague thematic gesture the way most of what we've discussed tonight has been. It is the show, in its own official episode title, printed on screen, indexed on every wiki and guide, plainly telling you, before the finale has even aired, exactly what the eventual resolution of the entire series is going to be. Not defeat your enemy through force. Not win the fight the way every previous cycle, across 14 billion years, has assumed the fight had to be won. Kill them with kindness. That is almost word for word what Pops actually does in the finale, refusing the punch, choosing the embrace, ending an eternal war, not by being strong enough to finally land the blow. Neither brother had ever been able to land, but by refusing to throw one at all. It's rare for a piece of long-form television foreshadowing to be this explicit and still somehow slip past most casual viewers, but that's exactly what happened here. An episode title functioning as an almost unbelievably direct prophecy, hidden in the one place nobody thinks to look for subtext, the label on the box. The coffee shop deserves a slower look here too, because it quietly rehearses, for years, the exact emotional failure the finale eventually asks Pops to overcome. For much of the show's run, it functions as a kind of parallel space to the park, somewhere Mordecai goes specifically to be near Margaret, and specifically to almost, but never quite, tell her how he feels. Episode after episode, he orders coffee, makes small talk, circles the actual thing he wants to say, and leaves without saying it. The show plays this as gentle, recurring comedy for a long stretch of its run, the universal, slightly pathetic ritual of a young man too afraid of rejection to just be honest. But it's also, read against everything the finale eventually asks of its most powerful character, a small-scale rehearsal of exactly the same failure at exactly the same emotional register. Pops, across the entire series, does something structurally identical to what Mordecai does at the coffee shop, except at cosmic scale, he avoids the truth of what he is, avoids the confrontation he was born for, retreats again and again into gentle confusion rather than facing the size of his own destiny, the same way Mordecai retreats into small talk rather than facing the size of his own feelings. And the show resolves both avoidances the same way, eventually, forcing each character to finally say the true frightening thing instead of ordering one more coffee, instead of taking one more punch. Mordecai's arc plays that lesson out over years, in a shop that smells like espresso and quiet humiliation. Pops's arc plays the same lesson out at the edge of a dying star. The show never states directly that it built these two arcs to mirror each other, and I want to be honest that this reading belongs to interpretation rather than confirmed intent. But once you've watched both arcs resolve the same way, in the same key, it becomes difficult to believe the rhyme is purely accidental, even if nobody involved in the writer's room ever wrote that connection down on a whiteboard. Underneath nearly everything we've discussed tonight sits a quieter, more structural kind of foreshadowing that isn't about any single object or character, but about the actual economic and emotional conditions the show kept its cast living inside for 8 years. Mordecai and Rigby are never given much money. They live in housing the park provides rather than housing they've earned on their own. They're constantly, believably at risk of being fired, dependent on the goodwill of a boss who is himself answerable to someone above him. The show treats the threat of losing their jobs, again and again, with a seriousness disproportionate to how small that threat should theoretically be, staged almost like a cosmic level event for the characters experiencing it. Read one way, and I'll flag this plainly as interpretation rather than confirmed authorial statement. That persistent, low grade precarity is the show quietly building the actual emotional floor underneath everything else that happens on top of it. The cosmic threats that show up week after week aren't really separate from that precarity. They're stacked directly on top of it, dressed in bigger, more explosively supernatural clothing, but running on the same underlying anxiety about how fragile the whole arrangement of a young adult's life can feel. And the finale's actual stakes, the complete unraveling and possible non existence of the entire universe, read emotionally as simply the largest possible version of a fear the show had been quietly rehearsing since its very first season. The fear of losing the fragile, barely held together life you've built for yourself. The fear that everything could simply stop, without warning, before you've finished becoming who you were supposed to become. The show spent years teaching its audience to feel that fear at the scale of a paycheck. By the time it asked you to feel it at the scale of existence itself, your nervous system had already been quietly trained to know exactly what that particular kind of dread was supposed to feel like. There's a related thread here about the show's relationship to masculinity and emotional withholding that's worth naming carefully because it edges closer to genuine interpretation than most of what we've covered tonight, and I want to be honest about that as we go. The cast is mostly male, the friendships mostly male, and across the run, the show returns again and again to moments where a male character finally, awkwardly, manages to say something true to someone he loves after seasons of avoiding exactly that. Mordecai eventually tells Margaret something honest. Rigby eventually owns his mistakes out loud instead of deflecting them. Muscle Man eventually mourns his father in the open instead of performing toughness around the grief. High Five Ghost eventually commits, fully and without irony, to a relationship. And Pops, when the moment finally arrives, eventually accepts, out loud, what he actually is, instead of retreating one more time into gentle confusion. One reading of this pattern, and again, I want to flag this as a fan interpretation rather than a stated intention from the creative team, is that the show is, underneath its cartoon premise, quietly building a long argument about what it actually costs young men, specifically, to learn how to feel things and say them plainly, treating that emotional labor again and again as the real stakes hiding underneath every explosive, supernatural threat the show ever staged. If that reading holds, then Pops's final act isn't really a departure from the show's values at all. It's the biggest possible version of a lesson the show had been teaching its whole run at every smaller scale about what it costs and what it eventually gives back to finally say the honest thing instead of throwing one more punch, drinking one more coffee, performing one more version of yourself that isn't quite true. And that finally brings us to forgiveness itself, which I think is the actual, quietest, most consistent piece of long range prophecy running underneath this entire show, present from nearly the beginning and paid off in full only in its very last moments. Across all 8 seasons, the show returns constantly to reconciliation. Brothers who've drifted apart, finding their way back to each other, old friends repairing things they'd let calcify into resentment, romantic partners finding some version of grudging peace even after a relationship has ended badly. Forgiveness, again and again, gets treated by the show as a genuinely powerful force, sometimes more powerful, emotionally, than the victories the show's plots technically require. And when the finale finally arrives at its actual climax, it doesn't resolve the oldest, largest conflict in its entire mythology through victory at all. Pops cannot defeat his brother by finally landing the blow neither of them has ever managed to land across 14 billion years of trying. He can only end the war by accepting him, by forgiving whatever it is that made Anti-Pops the way he is, by choosing an embrace over the ending everyone, including the two brothers themselves, had always assumed was the only ending available. The show never announces in so many words that this is its actual thesis. It just keeps rehearsing forgiveness, quietly, patiently, at every smaller scale it can find. Family conflicts, workplace conflicts, romantic conflicts, until the day finally arrives when it needs to stage forgiveness at the largest possible scale there is, the fate of all existence itself. And by then, the show has spent 8 years training its audience not to be surprised that forgiveness, of all things, turns out to be strong enough to hold up an entire universe. I want to close the loop on Skips one more time before we start winding down for the night, because there's a piece of his mythology that functions as one of the show's quieter admissions that the park was never really operating alone. The Guardians of Eternal Youth, the order that granted Walks his immortality back in 1814, aren't simply a one-off plot device invented to explain his backstory. They recur, sparingly, across the show's run, always staged with a gravity that feels closer to an old institution than a stunt cameo, always suggesting, without ever quite spelling it out, that Skips belongs to something larger than his job title implies, some ongoing order tasked with holding lines against threats most people never learn existed. It's a small, easy detail to overlook precisely because the show gives it so little screen time, a handful of appearances scattered across years, never explained in full. But it means that long before Lollyland, long before Pops and Anti-Pops, and the ancient murals depicting their endless war, the show had already quietly established that its own reality contained hidden orders of guardianship, older than they look institutions, doing unglamorous, unexplained work to keep larger threats contained. When the finale finally reveals the true cosmic scale of what Pops has actually been protecting the world from his entire life, it isn't introducing an entirely new category of idea into the show's universe. It's simply revealing that the category the show had already established once, quietly, through skips, went a great deal higher up than anyone watching had previously been given reason to suspect. And maybe that's the last thing worth sitting with tonight, before we let the park go quiet. The fact that a show mostly remembered for being a funny, low stakes cartoon about two slacker groundskeepers turns out, on this kind of close, patient rewatch, to have been quietly rehearsing its own biggest ideas from almost its very first episode onward, in places nobody was really looking for them. Not because every single writer in every single room sat down years in advance with a master document mapping 14 billion years of cosmic war onto a keyboard found in an attic. I don't think that's what happened, and I want to be honest one more time that a lot of what we've walked through tonight lives closer to interpretation than confirmed fact. Generous readings built by an audience that loved this show enough to go looking for meaning in its smallest corners. But something did happen here that's worth naming plainly, regardless of how deliberate any single piece of it actually was. A show that only ever really had one true thing to say about growing up, about finishing what you've been avoiding, about choosing honesty over another comfortable evasion, about forgiveness holding more weight than victory ever could, kept finding new rooms to say that same true thing in over and over at every scale it could reach, until the story had rehearsed itself so many times in so many registers that by the time it needed to say the whole thing at once, at the scale of an entire universe, it already knew exactly how. There's one more image worth pulling apart before we let the night close in, because it involves the literal final shot of the series, and it turns out to be its own small act of quiet mercy. One the show had actually been earning the right to for years. After the battle, after the sacrifice, after the memorial and the mourning and the long, slow return home, the show's very last frame doesn't leave you with grief. It leaves you with Pops, somewhere soft and bright, somewhere that plays unmistakably like a version of heaven, watching over the rest of his friends' lives as they unfold below him without him. That's documented plainly in recaps of the finale, not a fan reading stitched together after the fact. An actual choice the show made with its literal last image. And once you sit with it, it becomes one more piece in everything we've spent tonight walking through, because the show had spent years training its audience through death himself, through resurrections played as comedy, through the entire cast's casual comfort with High Five Ghost simply being dead and simply being fine, to believe that mortality in this particular universe is softer than it looks, more negotiable, less final than it would be anywhere else. Pops's death, when it finally comes, is allowed to be real, allowed to cost something, allowed to be genuinely, unmistakably a loss. But the show's very last choice, its literal final shot, quietly extends to its most important character, the exact same mercy it had been extending to smaller characters for years. He doesn't simply vanish. he goes somewhere gentle. I gets to keep watching the people he loved find the ordinary, unglamorous lives he gave everything to make possible for them. The show never needed to explain that choice out loud, because by the time it made it, it had spent 8 years quietly building an audience that already believed, without needing to be told, that endings in this world are allowed to be soft even when they're also allowed to be sad. I want to spend a little time, too, on the show's smaller, quieter parties, because they carry one last, easy to miss piece of the same argument the finale eventually makes at full scale. Across the run, the show returns again and again to a fairly simple structure. Somebody needs to throw a party. The staff reluctantly agrees to help. Something supernatural threatens to ruin it, and the party either survives against all odds or transforms into a cosmic confrontation that happens to resolve in everyone's favor anyway. On the surface, these are some of the show's lightest, most disposable feeling episodes, filler in the least generous sense of the word. But look at what the show actually does with them. It keeps insisting over and over that showing up for a birthday, staying late for a friend, choosing to be present for something small and unglamorous is doing the same emotional work as saving the universe, just scaled down to the size of a backyard. And when the finale finally arrives at its own version of that same idea, the reward the show hands its characters for surviving the largest possible version of that test isn't fame or power or cosmic significance. It's exactly the same small, unglamorous thing the party episodes had been quietly celebrating for years: an ordinary life, a family, a few friends who still show up for each other decades later. Nobody in the finale's closing montage becomes famous or rich or powerful beyond reason. They get homes and partners and small projects and reunions where everyone gathers, older and softer, to remember what they used to be together. The show had been quietly rehearsing, one birthday party at a time, exactly what kind of victory it actually believed in, long before it ever had the chance to hand that victory out at the largest possible scale it could reach. Even Eileen's small, unglamorous list deserves a place in this walk, the one she puts together of everything she wanted to accomplish before turning 25, presented half as a joke by the time she actually shows it to Mordecai and Rigby. Most of the items on it already things she's outgrown or stopped caring about. Buried in that list is an offhand line about wanting to end up with someone smart, a detail that quietly sets Rigby's entire late diploma arc into motion, sends him back to a high school classroom in his late 20s to finish what he'd abandoned years earlier. It's a small, almost throwaway moment, a joke about a list nobody expects to matter, and it ends up being the actual hinge that the show's most human, least cosmic redemption arc swings on. That's worth sitting with on its own terms, separate from every cosmic thread we've walked through tonight, because it's a reminder that not every piece of foreshadowing in this show points toward Lollyland or ancient murals or 14 billion years of failed battles. Some of it points towards something much smaller and, in its own way, just as important: the idea that an offhand comment, made half jokingly by someone who loves you, can quietly become the whole reason You finally go back and finish the thing you'd been avoiding for years. Margaret's own departure from the show deserves one more careful pass here, separate from the broader Margaret versus CJ conversation we walked through earlier, because the specific way the show handles her leaving carries its own quiet foreshadowing about what kind of adulthood the finale would eventually consider a genuine victory. After years of being tangled, at least in the audience's mind, into Mordecai's romantic arc, Margaret makes the choice to leave the coffee shop behind and pursue journalism school, building a career and a life that has nothing to do with the park, nothing to do with Mordecai, nothing to do with the love triangle so much of the fandom had spent years invested in. The show treats that decision with a level of seriousness that surprised some viewers at the time, refusing to keep her orbiting the protagonist's emotional gravity the way a lot of workplace sitcoms would have been tempted to. She gets her own ambitions, she gets her own future, and crucially, when she does eventually return, in later appearances, she isn't punished narratively for having left, and Mordecai doesn't spend those later appearances pining after what he lost. Read against everything the finale eventually does with its full cast. That's not really a side plot at all. It's a smaller, earlier rehearsal of the exact thing the show's ending would go on to insist about every one of its characters, that a genuinely satisfying adult life doesn't require staying tethered to where you started, that leaving the place or the person or the version of yourself you used to orbit around is allowed to be growth rather than loss. Margaret's arc quietly modeled that idea for the audience years before the show needed the entire cast to scatter, gracefully and without bitterness, into separate lives that could still occasionally find their way back to each other. And Mordecai's own quiet, recurring relationship with painting is worth one final look because it's one of the gentlest, least dramatic pieces of foreshadowing the show ever built, sitting in plain view for years before the finale finally cashed it in. Across the run, in scattered, easy to miss moments, Mordecai doodles, sketches, cares about how things look, occasionally reveals a genuine talent for drawing that the show never makes a big production out of. It's simply part of who he is, a small, consistent thread of visual sensitivity running underneath a character mostly defined, on the surface, by video games and procrastination. The show never announces this as a setup for anything. It's just there, quietly, episode after episode, the same way the keyboard sat quietly in the attic for years before anyone needed it to bend reality. And then, in the finale's closing montage, when the show finally answers the question of what kind of adult Mordecai actually becomes, the answer isn't a surprise pulled from nowhere. He becomes a working artist, finds success doing exactly the kind of thing the show had been quietly seeding in the margins of nearly every season that came before. It's a small, unglamorous example of the same pattern we've walked through again and again tonight at every possible scale, cosmic and human alike. The show planting something early, letting it sit unremarked for years, trusting that when the moment finally came to need it, the seed would already be there, waiting, exactly where it had always been. There's one earlier episode worth returning to before we close, because it's the actual first crack in Pops's ordinary surface, and it arrives a full season before the nightmare alien ever shows up looking for his address. In an episode centered on Pop's finally opening up about the planet he came from, the show lets slip, almost in passing, that he possesses a strange telekinetic ability, objects lifting quietly into the air around him under emotional strain, a power the show doesn't dwell on or explain in any real depth at the time. It plays in the moment, like a small, sweet piece of character texture, one more odd detail about a man who's already established as being a little different from everyone else at the park. It isn't treated as a mystery to be solved. It's treated the way the show treats most of its stranger details, offered plainly and then folded quietly back into the background, the same unassuming way the keyboard in the attic had been folded into the background years earlier. And that's exactly what makes it function, in hindsight, as such a clean, deliberate piece of foreshadowing rather than an accident. The show is fully aware, at the moment it lets that power show up on screen, that it means something, and it chooses to let it sit there quietly rather than explain it, trusting that the explanation could wait, could arrive a full season later, could arrive properly only once the story was ready to actually reveal what Pops was. And it's worth sitting one more time with the actual texture of that revelation once it finally does arrive on Lollyland, because the sensory details of it are easy to lose underneath the plot summary. The natives who greet the park crew are strange, gentle, slightly absurd beings, a mushroom headed figure among them, speaking with the same casual, unbothered tone the show usually reserves for its comic relief, right up until they lead the crew toward the old painted wall panels showing the endless history of the war. There's something genuinely eerie about that scene if you slow down inside it. A group of characters who have spent years being the show's source of easy laughs suddenly standing in front of ancient, weathered artwork, explaining, without much drama in their voices, that everything happening right now has already happened over and over, more times than anyone present can properly count. The show doesn't score that moment as a horror reveal. It doesn't linger on dread. It simply lets the information land quietly, the way the show has always let its biggest ideas land, without insisting that you feel the size of what you've just been told. That restraint is, I think, part of why the moment works as well as it does. A story that had spent 200 episodes being funny and small suddenly hands you a piece of cosmic scripture and doesn't even raise its voice while doing it. And somehow, that quietness makes the weight of it land harder than shouting ever could have. It's worth naming, plainly, one last time, exactly how much of tonight's walk sits on solid, verifiable ground, and how much of it belongs to the softer, more generous territory of interpretation, because I think that distinction is actually part of what makes a show like this worth returning to years later. The cosmic mythology itself, Pops and Anti-Pops, their true names, their 14 billion year cycle, the murals on Lollyland, the ending's actual mechanics, all of that is documented plainly, confirmed by the aired episodes themselves and by the show's own production notes. Skip's backstory, Mona's death, the Guardians of Eternal Youth, the exact shape of the finale's closing montage, all of that is equally solid. The show's casting choices, the Robert Englund detail, the Sam Marin doubling, the literal title of an episode called Kill 'Em with Kindness, the recorded interviews where its creator describes knowing an ending was coming. All of that is fact, not reading. What sits more loosely, and what I've tried to flag honestly every time we crossed into it tonight, is the deeper question of intention, whether the writers actually meant for the keyboard, or the coffee shop, or Muscle Man's grief, or Margaret's departure, to rhyme this precisely with a cosmic war they may not have fully mapped out until years later. I don't think anyone can answer that with certainty, and I'm not sure it would even change how any of it feels if someone eventually did. Sometimes a story becomes prophetic simply because it only ever had one true thing to say, and it kept finding smaller rooms to say that thing in long before it was ready to say it at full size. And whether that counts as planning or as instinct might not matter nearly as much as the fact that somehow, by the end, all of it turned out to be pointing at exactly the same place. That's the whole shape of it, really, once you lay it all out end to end. A small joke about a keyboard, a half-second glimpse of a face in a window, an old Yeti who never walks, a hat that says excellent, a title card that says exactly what the ending would eventually do. None of them shout. None of them ask to be noticed. They just wait, patiently, the way good things in the dark tend to wait, for someone willing to come back through slowly enough to actually see them. So let's let it settle now, the way we always do toward the end of one of these. Let the park go quiet around you. The keyboard is back in the attic, unremarkable again, waiting the way it always was, for nobody in particular, doing nothing at all until the day it's needed. Somewhere Skips is standing on the porch of the house, not aging, not resting, carrying a memory of someone named Mona that he has never once let himself set down. Somewhere. Mr. Maillard is looking at his son across a room and saying nothing about what he knows, the way he always has, the way he always did. Somewhere on an old painted wall on a planet none of us will ever visit, two brothers are shown fighting the same fight they have always fought, across a span of time too large to hold in your head, and somewhere else, in a version of that fight that finally happened differently, they are shown, instead, holding each other, drifting slowly into a sun. The show never told you outright that all of these small, scattered things were pointing at the same place. It let you find that out slowly, the way you find out just of the true things in your own life, not through a single dramatic reveal, but through years of small, easy to miss moments that only start to rhyme with each other once you're far enough down the road to look back and actually see the shape of the path you've been walking. That's what tonight has been, not a list of clues. A walk back through a shape that was always there, waiting for you to be tired enough, quiet enough, patient enough to finally see it whole. If you've made it this far, you've spent a long, slow while back in that park with me tonight, further into it than most people ever bother going, and I hope some part of you is already drifting, already halfway into whatever comes after this. The show ended years ago, and it also, somehow, didn't. And either way, it's still exactly the kind of place you can always walk back into whenever you need to. So take whatever you found in it tonight along with you into sleep, And if this is the kind of company you'd like to keep at this hour, make sure you're subscribed so I know to leave the porch light on for you next time. Rest well. I'll see you in the park.